Support for this segment and the following message provided by Freak Out and Carry On, a new podcast about politics through the lens of history, hosted by journalist Ron Suskind and historian Heather Cox Richardson, available wherever you get podcasts and on the WBUR Listen app.
From WBUR Boston and NPR, I'm Tom Ashbrook, and this is On Point. Investigative reporter Robert Parry has been around the block a few times. Back in the 1980s, even his own editors sometimes had a hard time believing what he unearthed. The White House disobeyed Congress and smuggled arms to Iran so they would fund a right-wing army in Central America? No way. Yes way. And Parry proved it, and a lot more. He's just won the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, and he's thinking about the U.S. news media and the story it tells us of reality. This hour On Point, award-winning investigative reporter Robert Parry on the American press and America's understanding of itself and the world. You can join us on air or online, where this conversation is always on. Do you get what you need from the U.S. news media, the American press? Are you sure? Join us anytime at onpointradio.org or on Twitter and Facebook at onpointradio. Joining me now from Washington is reporter Robert Parry, editor of Consortium News, the first investigative news magazine on the Internet back in the mid-'90s. He won the George Polk Award for his reporting on the Iran-Contra affair, breaking many of the stories as the scandal unfolded. The most recent of his many books is America's Stolen Narrative, From Washington and Madison to Nixon, Reagan, and the Bushes to Obama. That title itself gives you an idea of where we're headed today. Parry has just won the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, presented by the Neiman Foundation. I was there for the awarding of the medal and thought you might want to hear from this man. Robert Parry, welcome to On Point. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Tom.
I really want to go back and look at some of the moments of digging that you've done in your long career as an investigative reporter. But I wish you'd unfold some of your own thesis here on America's Stolen Narrative, the title of your last book. How does a country's narrative get stolen, and what does the performance of the news media have to do with that?
Well, there's an effort by many people in various positions of power to get the American people to believe what makes the most sense for the people in power to want them to believe. And we've seen this really evolving during my period in Washington from the 1970s, when, if you think back to that time, just after the Vietnam War, there was the Pentagon Papers. We then had the Watergate scandal. We then had disclosures about the CIA's secret operations, including assassinations, the so-called family jewels. Mm-hmm. And those were all sort of coming out at that time, and it reached the point that the American people were very distrustful of their government. It was very hard for the government to get the American people riled up again to go into more foreign adventures. And that was a challenge that was facing the government when Ronald Reagan becomes president in the 1980s. And we now can see from many of the declassified records from that era that the Reagan people took this all very seriously. They had this goal of what they called kicking the Vietnam syndrome. And the way they did it was to try to get the American people to believe in a world that wasn't really there. It was a propagandized, extreme version of the world out there. And by doing that, to get the American people more ready to have more support for wars in the future. There was even an effort early on in the Reagan administration to bring in CIA experts, people who were used to targeting foreign countries with propaganda and disinformation, and bring them into the White House and have them set up similar programs for the American public. It was headed by a fellow named Walter Raymond Jr., who was the top propagandist at the CIA. He was sent over by his boss, William Casey, the director. And he set up at the National Security Council these efforts to have interagency task forces to figure out how best to sell these issues to the American people. And the advice he always gave to his subordinates was to glue black hats on America's enemies and glue white hats on the groups that the American government was supporting. In the case of the Contras in Nicaragua, those were the rebels fighting the leftist government in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas. his advice was to glue the black hats on the Sandinistas and to glue the white hats on the Contras. And so you had this issue framed as the Contras were the moral equals of the founding fathers, in a phrase that Reagan was scripted to read. And the Sandinistas in Nicaragua was a totalitarian dungeon. So you had this mythology that was pushed to sort of create these almost fictional characters as a way to get the American people back in line so they would begin to support these efforts going forward. And we've seen how that's evolved since then. It's been sort of a bipartisan effort to really manipulate the American people. There was a phrase that the Reagan folks like to use called perception management. They had to manage the perceptions of the American people about the world around us. So it was really an effort through using propaganda and the U.S. news media to get the American people back under some control. So they would rally to things like, as we've now seen, the Iraq War in just last decade. And always the same kinds of approaches. The enemies always are wearing black hats. The U.S. side is always wearing white hats. But that's not really the reality. So in a sense, the true narrative, the true reality out there has been stripped away on behalf of the interests of the powerful forces in Washington who want to maintain a large military budget or want to get the U.S. involved in some of these foreign adventures.
You bring that right up to date in your book, America's Stolen Narrative. You assert that a kind of false history, in effect, entrapped Barack Obama. How?
Well, I think it's been true of some of the Democrats that they have been often unwilling to press for the truth about Republicans. There's a much greater timidity on the part of Democrats, as we've seen over the years. They tend to want to let bygones be bygones, move on to more pragmatic issues. So, for instance, after the end of the Reagan Bush 1 years, you had a number of still pending scandals where the truth had really not been developed. Iran-Contra, we still did not know about, and that's this remarkable scandal where the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to the Iranians, often through Israel, and then some of the profits went back to the Contras in Nicaragua. But we never even quite figured out where that started, and the history was, in a sense, truncated because when we get to the period of the early 90s, there was a loss of interest in trying to find the real truth. And then after Bill Clinton becomes president, there was an idea, well, let's just let that slide into the history. Mm-hmm. We'll just go forward. And we saw something similar with President Obama. When he took office, he said we have to look forward, not backward. So the crimes committed during the Bush II administration, torture, the whole reasons for the Iraq War, all these very important issues to really determine what had actually happened, they were sort of set aside. Even in Britain, you had much more interest in trying to figure out how Great Britain got involved in the Iraq War. You have the Chilcot Commission, for instance. But in the United States, there was nothing like that. There was no serious review of how the Iraq War happened. There were a few pieces of it because some of the Senate committees looked at the torture issue. But it was all very limited and not the kind of serious effort that one might expect from a real democracy.
Robert Parry, you talk about the White House, especially under Ronald Reagan, looking back at the 70s, the American people kind of being off the reservation or, not taking the bit, not taking the harness. They wanted them back into a kind of control, wanted to use perception management to do that, and using the U.S. news media to corral the American view of the world again. The news media typically presents itself as not something to be used, but rather, as the body that will be the watchdog in our society of what's going on. So use how?
Well, I think that's the old view of the press. I'm not sure many people really view it that way today. If you go back to the 70s, it was not a real golden era, but let's just say it was an era when the press was doing its job more responsibly, digging into some serious issues of government criminality, whether it be lying to get the country into the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, which were published by the New York Times and Washington Post and other major news organizations. And then you had the Watergate scandal, which is somewhat of a follow-on scandal, really, to the Pentagon Papers. We now know that they were essentially linked because Nixon was afraid that some of his lies about the Vietnam War would also come out, which led him to be sort of paranoid and set up the plumbers unit in the first place. Mm-hmm. So we have this idea that the press was doing its job more or less back then, but it had to be also reined in. And during the Reagan era, there was a very serious effort to bring us under control. I was at the Associated Press for most of that time, and later Newsweek. And what I saw was there was pressure on the press in a fairly sophisticated way, but there also was at the higher levels of the news media a sense that maybe things had gone too far in the 70s, and that it wasn't, quote, good for the country, a phrase that I would hear often, and that it might be best if the press didn't write so critically about the government. The people that were running the press at the time were people I dealt with in the news media, people like a Keith Fuller at the Associated Press or Maynard Parker at Newsweek. These people really shared many of the views of a more aggressive U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. standing tall in the world. They were less about informing the people of all the facts than sort of making sure the public didn't think too badly of some of these policies. So what we ended up with was both externally from the Reagan administration at the time, and they had many allies and they had attack groups that went after some of us, groups like Accuracy in Media, for instance. But there was also a sense at the higher levels of the news media that maybe the press should get a bit lighter on terms of looking at these dirty secrets of the U.S. government.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. We're talking this hour with investigative journalist Robert Parry, 2015 winner of the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, named after the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. Very prominent in the years when Robert Parry was coming up and into the business. Published I.F. Stone's weekly, self-published newsletter for many years, a gadfly in Washington, independent journalist, kind of the definition thereof. We're looking at the state of the American news media today and what we don't know about our own country's story, its living history. Robert Parry is author of America's Stolen Narrative, Neck Deep, Secrecy and Privilege, Trick or Treason, Fooling America, and many more. Joins us today from Washington. You can join us as well. Do you feel like you're getting the whole unvarnished story on what's going on from the American news media today? Is that too much to ask? Should we have known much earlier about the October surprise all the way back when Ronald Reagan was elected? Should we have known about the CIA and cocaine trafficking in the 1980s? What's the missing history as you see it today? The lack of understanding can trap the American people and American leaders. Here was President Barack Obama, January 2009, at his inaugural.
To all the other peoples and governments who are watching today, from the grandest capitals to the small village where my father was born, know that America is a friend of each nation and every man, woman, and child who seeks a future of peace and dignity, and we are ready to lead once more.
There, Barack Obama being inaugurated. But Robert Parry says if you don't know your history, if you don't know what's happened, you don't know what's going on even now, maybe even if you're the President of the United States. Robert, we have callers for you. Scott in Milton, Massachusetts. Scott, you're on the air with investigative reporter Robert Parry.
Yes, hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Mm-hmm. I just this morning was reading an article that the idea of perception management comes so clearly to me. It's the New York Times article on the Russians suspiciously being around the internet intercontinental cable.
The undersea cables, saying there's been a lot of Russian submarine activity there, Scott.
Yes, and I was just thinking the structure of the article could have been so much different. It looks like we've had a program since 1971 of extracting information from these same cables. But I just wondered who's responsible for creating the layout of such an article in a way that is fear-mongering and also supports more military hardware. It mentions about the Russians' capacity to have very high-tech ships to work at sea, extracting this information.
Scott, let us pick it up. Robert Parry, there's a story right out of today's headlines. One might look at that and say, well, why not understand that Russians are active around Internet cables, which are so important to so much communication these days? But Scott's picking up on your concern about presentation and perception management. What do you say?
Well, sure. I think he's correct to be concerned about that. I think there has been an effort to, I guess you might say, glue black hats on the Russians and on President Putin these days. And sometimes it's easier to talk about these things in a bit more distance. When they're happening, it's extremely hard to write honestly about these international conflicts where the U.S. government has portrayed someone as a real bad guy, and usually there's some truth to that. It's not like the person with the black hat it deserves a white hat necessarily, but this idea of hyping these fears of the American people has been part of what this whole idea has been. If you go back to those days in the early 1980s, you have to make the American people frightened of things. And if you can make them frightened of these foreign enemies, and they can be made 10 feet tall, they can be wildly exaggerated in terms of how dangerous they are, then the American people are more susceptible to voting for more military hardware. The military-industrial complex does very well, thank you. And then you also have inside the news media, and this has been an increasing development too, the group that we might call the neoconservatives, who've come out of that period of the late 70s and early 80s. I knew some of them when they were real pups. They were just coming into their own, like I guess I was. But and they became more and more influential. They're very smart. They're very well educated, well read, and they are good at working on op-ed pages. They work for think tanks that are quite prominent and get a lot of space. And eventually they began to increasingly take over some key positions in the news media. We have, for instance, the Washington Post editorial page is pretty heavily run by the neoconservatives these days. So you do have that influencing the kind of coverage we've seen on a number of these issues. And clearly one of the top ones right now is to make the American people angry and frightened of the Russians. And not to say there's not some reality there, but a lot of it has been hyped, much as we saw before the Iraq War, when we were told that Saddam Hussein, who certainly was no white hat, but he was made into some worse than Hitler kind of monster who was going to be handing nuclear weapons off to Al-Qaeda. And it was much of that was fiction, as we now know. And so we should always be very skeptical, I think, when we're in these moments when the government and even the news media reflecting the views of the government, starts pushing these extreme themes about foreign enemies, because that's when we get really wrapped up into some of these more destructive actions that do not serve the American national interest well at all, and certainly not the democracy.
Robert Parry, I wish you'd take us back to some kind of just the facts, ma'am, recollection of how this worked when you were doing some of your biggest investigative reporting, and I know it goes on to this day, but take us back to Iran-Contra, the CIA, and how it got involved in cocaine trade, and what it was like to be a reporter in the middle of that, how you winkled those stories out, and the reception they got when you took them to your press bosses at the time.
Well, when I was with the Associated Press, I was assigned to the Special Assignment Team. It was at the end of 1980, so essentially the beginning of the Reagan era. And that was their investigative unit. And I focused a good deal on their Central America policy, the Reagan Central American policy, because it was a key issue that they were concerned about. And it was one where I soon began to become aware that they were wildly exaggerating some of the threats from Central America. We were seeing this hyped up idea that the Cubans were going to come through Nicaragua and then up through Mexico and into Texas. There was a lot of over-the-top kind of excessive fear-mongering that was going on, considering the nature of the actual problem or threat. So my reporting tended to reflect that skepticism, because what I was finding was a lot less alarmist than what the Reagan administration was trying to sell. So there was a certain amount of friction there, both with the Reagan administration and some of my executives at the Associated Press. I mentioned the general manager, Keith Fuller, believed very deeply that we should support the Reagan policies, that he felt that this was an important turning point in America, away from a kind of more defeatist 1970s attitude to a more America standing tall attitude of the 1980s. He was excited by that, and he wanted his reporters to kind of be in line with that.
Your reporting led to the uncovering of Iran-Contra, the CIA cocaine connection. How do you get there?
Well, so basically, when it came to as I kept following the issues of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and their Contra opponents who were being supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, there were more and more scandals that were involved. The Contras were not the white hats. They weren't the moral equals of the founding fathers. That was all propaganda. So I discovered things like there were some manuals that were being prepared by the CIA for the Contras, including one that advocated assassinations and setting up essentially false flag assassinations of their own people to blame it on the other side. So there were things like that that upset the Congress when they became out, and the Congress cut off funding for the Contras and forbade the Reagan administration from continuing these policies. The Reagan people then chose to take it under cover in defiance of Congress, in defiance really of the Constitution that gives the Congress essential control over whether we wage war or not. And they did it secretly through private funding, and in following the money for that, there were private donors, there were third countries kicking in, and that's where, when I was working with Brian Barger, my very very talented colleague at AP, we discovered that the Contras also were getting funding and support from their involvement in the drug trade. The Medellin cartel and other drug traffickers were using the cover of the Contra movement to get some of their product into the United States. And so by the end of late 1985, we had put that story together. We had a couple of dozen sources. We had documents. We even had a source inside the National Security Council who read to me some from a CIA report confirming parts of this. So we had DEA officials who were confirming it on background. So we tried to go with that story, and the AP management up in New York really didn't want the story. So there was a point when we thought we had it cleared for approval. I sent it into the bureau chief in Washington with his initials at the top, and he. And I thought we were ready to go with it. And then he came out sheepishly and said, well, no, they've decided not to do it.
And this was the story, not the original of Iran-Contra, but of the CIA cocaine connection we're talking about.
Right. This is about the Contras being involved in the cocaine trade. Mm-hmm. And basically all the major Contra groups, there were several groups involved, but all of them had gotten involved with the cocaine trade, and we had it nailed.
And the CIA was aware of this and was not intervening.
Right. The CIA and the White House, they both were aware this was a problem, but they treated it as a public relations issue, really. They did not want to have they really saw the fight, the Cold War, having the Contras there to fight the Sandinistas as more important than protecting the American public from these drugs coming in. Mm-hmm. But as far as the AP story was, it ended up going accidentally, really, to the Spanish language side of AP, and they simply translated it and put it out, not realizing there was this other battle going on at the top levels of the company. And then when that happened, I rather sheepishly, when I found out that it happened, I went into the bureau chief and said, well, the story seems to be out in Spanish. And so they did put the story out in English as well.
Go upstream from there for us, back to how the whole Iran-Contra connection came out, the reporting that went into that, arms being traded back to Iran, cash to the Contras.
Right. Well, we were focused mostly at that time on the Contra side of things, and there was a disclosure that came out in Beirut. Basically, the Iran-Contra scandal breaks in October of 1986 when one of the planes that Oliver North, who was the National Security Council aide who was in charge of the program, one of the planes he was using to drop weapons to the Contras got shot down inside Nicaragua. And it started spilling out, confirming a lot of the stories we'd been already done in terms of how this was being run out of the White House secretly. And by the way, the White House was denying everything. They were just lying to the American public. So then about a month later, a disclosure comes out in Beirut about the issue of the Reagan people selling arms to the Iranians. And again, this was vociferously denied by the White House, by Reagan himself, by Vice President Bush, by others. It turns out that, of course, it was true, and that eventually was confirmed. And then it was discovered that some of the profits had gone to the Contras as well. So you had the scandal became the Iran-Contra scandal. But there were several elements to it. It was a complicated scandal. There was money laundering involved. There were really gross violations of U.S. law involved, with both violations of the Arms Export Control Act, where Congress is supposed to be informed when U.S. weapons are shipped. There were violations of money laundering regulations and laws. So you had a very serious scandal. But the question to me became, over time, how did it really start? And as we went deeper into the facts of the matter, it became clear that this was not something that just started in 1985 and 86, like the official narrative. That it just kept going back in time, and it became clear that Reagan had approved arms sales to the Iranians as early 1981, right after he took office.
When they had just had all the American hostages for so long, when the Great Satan and the huge standoff between these two countries was so hot.
Right. So you had this rather remarkable fact that just after those hostages were finally released, they were released on the just almost the exact same time as Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981. The hostages finally were released after 444 days of captivity, and Reagan pretty much turned around after that and approved arms sales to the Iranians via Israel. And these pieces just weren't really matching up to what the official story was, and that led eventually to people looking back to the 1980 campaign and whether or not the Republicans had made their initial contacts with the Iranians even before they took office, before the election in 1980, and whether or not they had tried to essentially sabotage President Carter's reelection efforts by making sure that he did not resolve the hostage crisis when he wanted to.
The so-called October surprise that never happened, but out came the hostages. Here was on January 20th, 1981, 20 minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated president, the 52 Americans held hostage for all that time were released. And here, courtesy of NBC News, is the new president, Reagan, then a short time later at an inaugural event announcing the hostage release.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Robert Parry followed it all the way back, and you found Republican operatives working with Iranians, maybe working at cross purposes with Jimmy Carter, the kind of history that Americans need to understand the very leadership of the country.
Yes, right. What we've been able to piece together now is obviously a lot more material available today than there was even 10, 20 years ago. Was that there were contacts? It's quite clear between some of the senior Republicans and the Iranians that it related to the hostages. There's still legitimate questions about some of the details as to exactly who did what when. But we have now dozens of sources, really, in terms of from key people in key positions saying that there were indeed these contacts. But it's remained a bit of what you might call lost history in the United States. Officially, it didn't happen, even though the evidence is now pretty clear that it did happen. And we see something similar with even like the Contra drug trafficking issue, where many people feel that it was a conspiracy theory that never happened, but the evidence is overwhelming that it did. And we also have now even the CIA back when it did a final Inspector General's report saying, yes, indeed, we did know about this for a decade and we didn't do anything about it.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. We're talking this hour with investigative journalist Robert Parry, 2015 winner of the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, about the state of the American news media today and what we don't know about our own country's story, its living history now. Robert Parry joins us from Washington. He is editor of Consortium News, consortiumnews.com. And you can join us. What's the missing history today? Are we asking the hard questions, getting the tough answers? What do you want from the press that you're not getting? Let's go straight to Jeffrey in Miami, Florida. Jeffrey, you're on the air with Robert Parry.
I think one of the balls that got dropped greatly by the press has been that George Bush, trying to distribute $12 billion of Saddam Hussein's money, took the cash and brought it into the tribal leaders of Iraq. And I believe that that was the start of ISIS, not anything else. And so I believe that the press basically abandoned that story and left the general public either to not know about it or to have very few of us to know about it, and therefore to have little discussion about it at all.
We do remember, I appreciate your call, Jeffrey, in Miami. We do remember those photographs of bales of cash flying around in the holds of huge cargo jets. Robert Parry, I don't know. Do you look there? Where do you look for what ought to be more illuminated today and is not?
Well, I think Jeffrey has a good point. What happened with the billions of dollars that not just the Saddam Hussein's money, but money that came from the U.S. Treasury and was shipped over to Iraq. Part of what was done with that money, and according to intelligence sources, was that it was paid to some of the Sunni tribal leaders and some of the former soldiers who had been decommissioned from Saddam's army after the U.S. invasion. It was paid for them during the surge period not to attack American troops. So you have, going back to 2006 and 2007, you had large sums of money that were going to these Sunni, fairly radical but somewhat just military people. And that when things then so they were stockpiled with lots of cash, and then when things got worse and worse between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Maliki government essentially turning on the Shiites, that did provide some funding mechanism for the Sunnis to organize, and we now know that group to be the Islamic State or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They, of course, then moved into Syria, where they were also carrying on the struggle between the Sunnis and, in that case, an Alawite or offshoot of Shia Islam. And so you had this sectarian struggle, which the United States really touched off by invading Iraq, and then, in a sense, as Jeffrey suggested, exacerbated in trying to tamp down the violence against American soldiers, provided some of the means for this later to develop into something else, even more dangerous. So there were a lot of unintended consequences in that, and I think it's part of that history that we've never had a real examination in the United States, at least an official one, of what happened with the Iraq War. It's been left as sort of an unexplored chapter. Yes, we know there have been pieces that have been broken by various journalists, and some of it we sort of know, but there's never been an effort to do a comprehensive examination of how this happened, how these trillions of dollars were spent overall, how the 4,500 American soldiers died, how the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, and how this has now spread into becoming not just a regional problem of destabilization, but is now even reaching into Europe to destabilize Europe. So it's a very important part of our history. And this does fit to the theme we've been talking about, that the American people have not been given the full story on by any means.
We live with the consequences of untold history. Laura in Lexington, Kentucky. Laura, you're on the air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I just want to let you know I really appreciate your reporting. Thank you for that. My question is, are we now experiencing the most corrupt media in the history of media?
That's a pretty big question, pretty broad question. Laura, why do you put it just that way?
Well, it just seems there's so many areas of the world that I'm concerned about. I mean, just as a person here living my life, and the Sudan, in Somalia, in Iraq, Iran, in Russia. I mean, it just seems to me that news has become has become wholesaled out, and the truth in reporting is homogenized into something that really just aligns, the people who are reporting it with either a party or a market. Are we so manipulated here, so easily manipulated by pundits that we have no idea what the truth is? I mean, is fact-checking just something that we have to do every single day when we listen to the news?
Laura, I appreciate your call and your elaboration there. Robert Parry, I don't know how far you'll go here. You hear Laura, she's got that great big question, and then her elaboration, very interesting.
Well, I think she's basically correct. I guess corrupt is a difficult word because it suggests something where you're being paid directly to do something wrong. I think it's a bit more indirect than that. But it's not. It's the concept is correct. I think journalism, as I was watching it develop in the 80s and 90s, became more and more commercialized. The way you got wealthy if you were a journalist was to become a talking head on TV. And plus, on the other side, there was a shrinking of the number of real news jobs there were. Companies were downsizing, consolidating. Of course, then the internet comes on, and many newspapers just shut down completely. So if you were a journalist, you were under enormous pressure to keep your reporting in line with what the people at the top of your organization wanted. If you deviated from that, you risked losing your job or certainly not getting a promotion, being sidetracked. And so there were a number of factors going into this. And as I say, there were huge rewards if you could somehow develop your reporting and journalism career into something which had a TV component, and you could become a kind of a star on TV and make, 7-figure incomes. So that's what we were kind of faced with. And I think journalists put aside often their responsibility to the American people and looked at it more in terms of how they could please their bosses. And many of the people at the top level of news really share the sort of worldview that you would get from maybe senior people on Wall Street or the senior people in the national security state. It was not necessarily the same idea of what's good for the American people at sort of the average working level of the American people. It was more what was good for the people at the top. So you did have a failure, and an increasing failure of the American press corps to ask the tough questions, to be that watchdog for the public. We certainly saw that with the Iraq War. I think we're seeing it continued. We're seeing very black and white kind of coverage of important, nuanced events. And so instead of the American people getting a clear view of what's going on in Ukraine or Syria or these different places, and there are two sides to these stories, we get sort of a one-sided account being delivered by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the other major news organizations. So corrupt may be a little bit harsh, but I think it's kind of on point too.
Comments for you online. Ark writes, the Fourth Estate is in shambles. Reporters jailed for reporting the truth. Whistleblowers silenced, hunted, and jailed. Integrity, this listener writes, has become the black hat in this country. MS writes, I'm sorry, but governments have always tried to create a narrative. What concerns me more is the press itself creating a narrative purely for the sake of its own agenda. Those two parted ways. You wrote about White House or government perception management. Do you see that as perfectly aligned with the interests of the press, or if not, then what's the motivator?
Well, I think as I talked about, there are financial motivations for journalists who try to keep their careers going forward.
But what does that mean? Just satisfying a kind of popular opinion?
Well, to some extent. I mean, there's the idea, well, what's the conventional wisdom, and let's try to keep our reporting within it. If you clash with the groupthink, and I would call it groupthink more than conventional wisdom even, mm-hmm. If you clash with the groupthink, your career is in jeopardy. We saw that during the period before the Iraq War. And now what you're seeing is even worse because President Obama has been cracking down on whistleblowers. And what that means for a journalist, especially covering national security, is that the give and take that was available when I was doing my work in the 80s and even the 90s has been replaced by fear among the people in the national security state. And many of them are honest people. They see their job as dealing with facts and sharing those facts with the top leadership. But when that maybe politically is not very popular with the political leadership, those people might want to talk to the press, but now they're extremely scared because President Obama has authorized the prosecution of people for even minor mistakes, as we've certainly seen with a number of these former CIA people who have been thrown in jail, and then you have other whistleblowers who have been prosecuted. Chelsea Manning is in jail for 35 years. So you have this fear that has been built up around anyone talking to the press outside the accepted, approved leaks. You'll still get the leaks that will serve the interests of what the government wants the public to believe, but you won't get the leaks that challenge what the government's trying to feed you.
William in Sunrise Beach, Missouri. William, you're on the air. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, you've just opened up a million doors of what I want to ask. But my first main question was the movie that portrayed, Kill the Messenger, that portrayed the journalist on the West Coast. I forgot his name.
Gary Webb.
Are you familiar? Okay.
Gary Webb.
Were you privy to any of his articles as he was breaking the cocaine connection also, or were you completely off on your own when you started to have your revelations about what was going on with this corruption?
Remind us in a nutshell what happened there, Robert Parry.
Well, basically, the Contras, the force that the U.S. was backing in Nicaragua, got itself tied up with the cocaine trade. Some of that goes even back to the very foundings of the Contras back in 1980, when people involved were also working with the Medellin cartel at that point. So the Contras were deeply enmeshed in the cocaine trade throughout the 1980s. Now, that was obviously something the Reagan administration didn't want people to know because it would have caused the Contras to be probably shut down completely. So we became, at the Associated Press, Brian Barger and I were working on these stories, and we became aware of this and reported initially in December of 1985 when it was still happening. Then Senator John Kerry did a fairly courageous investigation that followed on our work and took it further, and his report came out in 1989. But it was mostly laughed at. The New York Times didn't take it seriously. The Washington Post basically made fun of it. And so the story kind of sits in limbo until 1996, when Gary Webb at the San Jose Mercury News comes upon information in a way that we had not looked at. His focus was really on the impact of the cocaine once it got here. Our reporting was more on the fact that it was coming. So he was able, by finding criminal cases in Los Angeles, to show how that some of that cocaine had fed into the crack epidemic, which then spread across the country. So he calls me actually before his first story in 1996, and my advice to him is to make sure that his editors are behind him. I said, this is a very touchy story. You're going to get a lot of heat. Your editors better be behind you, or it's going to be trouble for you. And he said, no, my editors are behind me. So he went ahead with his stories for the San Jose Mercury News, and then the black communities around the country got very upset about this, as you might expect. And then it became something that had to be put down. And the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times all ganged up on Gary Webb. It was sort of easier. It was harder for them to admit they'd screwed up on a major story like this in the 80s. And some of the people who had sort of put us down back then were now senior people in those news organizations. They'd risen in terms of their position. So it was easier to destroy Gary Webb than to revisit this difficult scandal. But what Webb did, which was very important, of course, his career was then ruined. He was driven out of journalism. He ultimately commits suicide in 2004. He can't find any work, and his whole life has fallen apart. And that's sort of what the movie deals with. But he did do something very, very important. He got the Central Intelligence Agency's Inspector General to do an investigation, and it was the first serious investigation. And in 1998, the CIA comes out with two reports, essentially confessing. The agency confessed to being well aware that the Contras were involved in the drug trade from the very beginning all the way through to the end, from 1980 to 1990. And that was an amazing admission. But again, the major news organizations essentially didn't want to deal with that either, because it made them look bad. So they kind of kissed it off, and the American people never got a real sense of what the truth was, even though the CIA had admitted it by and large. So that's the kind of problem you have when the news media stops being responsible to tell the public what it needs to know and is more concerned about careers and not rocking the boat and staying in line with what the government sort of wants you to know. And we saw a complete failure at that point, and we've seen that failure continue onward. I mean, subsequent to that failure, you had the failure of the Iraq War. So you have the American press really leaving the American people kind of out on their own to figure things out, and it's very difficult. That's one of the reasons I started ConsortiumNews.com in 1995, was to try to deal with some of those well-reported, well-documented stories. We're not talking conspiracy theories by any means. These are real events that happened in our country that affected us, but that were embarrassing to the government and were therefore shunted aside.
Robert Parry, it is a very admirable personal history that you brought to journalism. Not an easy path to go up against powers that don't want those stories told, but you've done it again and again. Honored last week with the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence. You give us a lot to think about here, about how the American people can try and lean toward more light and clarity in the reporting they get. I hope we can talk another time about your advice on that front. But for today, congratulations to you. Please keep doing it, and thank you very much for being with us this hour.
Thank you, Tom.
Robert Parry, award-winning investigative reporter, author, documentary filmmaker, winner of the 2015 I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence. I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point.